The courtroom fell silent as Officer Jason Miller leaned back in the witness chair, his smug grin widening with every word he spoke. "Your Honor, it's clear this defendant doesn't belong in civilized society. I mean, just look at her." He gestured dramatically toward the woman sitting quietly at the defense table, a flicker of anger crossing her face as she tightened her jaw. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, people exchanging uneasy glances, wondering how far Jason would go to ridicule this woman. He laughed, clearly enjoying the attention. "Honestly, I'm surprised she even knows how to spell her name, let alone defend herself." The judge banged the gavel. "Order in the court." The woman didn't respond to the insult, her eyes sharp and calculating, locked onto Jason's face. Her lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, as if she knew something no one else in the room did. 3 months earlier, in a small law office on the edge of town, Grace Williams was poring over a case file late into the evening. Fresh out of law school, she was struggling to make a name for herself. The hours were grueling, and the pay was almost non-existent, but she refused to quit. This was her chance to build the life she dreamed of. Grace's drive to succeed wasn't born out of ambition alone. She had experienced life at rock bottom. Just a year ago, she was on the other side of the courtroom, sitting where defendants often sat. An unfair arrest and a harsh cop had cost her dearly, humiliating her in front of the entire town. She knew what it felt like to be powerless, but she swore she would never let anyone have that kind of control over her again. Her arrest wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, Grace decided to fight back by learning the law. She studied relentlessly, fueled by the memory of that officer's cruel words and the laughter in the courtroom. She wanted to make sure no one else would go through what she did. Grace was still lost in her work when her phone buzzed. It was her best friend, Maya. "Hey, Grace," Maya said, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "I know you're busy, but you've been working nonstop. You need a break." "I can't," Grace replied. "This case is important. If I don't get this right, my client could lose everything. You've been through so much. Don't forget to take care of yourself." "Okay." Grace smiled despite her exhaustion. "Thanks, Maya. I'll try." But she didn't. She stayed up until the early hours of the morning, determined to prove herself. Across town, Jason Miller was finishing his shift. He was a rising star in the police department, known for his confidence and sharp wit. But his reputation wasn't spotless. There were whispers about his harsh treatment of certain individuals and his tendency to mock those he considered beneath him. That night, Jason was assigned to patrol a quieter part of town. He pulled over a beat-up sedan for a broken taillight. Inside was a young man who looked nervous, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Evening," Jason said, shining his flashlight into the car. "License and registration." The man fumbled with his glove compartment, his anxiety clear. Jason smirked, leaning against the car door. "Relax, buddy. It's just a broken taillight. Unless you've got something to hide," his tone mocking, designed to rattle the man further. The man handed over his documents with trembling hands. Jason ran the information through his system, finding nothing suspicious. Still, he couldn't resist making a few snide comments before finally letting the man go. As the car drove away, Jason chuckled to himself. He thrived on the power his badge gave him, not realizing how quickly that power could be turned against him. The next morning, Grace sat in a coffee shop reviewing her notes. Her latest client was a woman falsely accused of shoplifting. The evidence against her was thin, but the arresting officer's testimony could sway the jury. Grace knew she had to be at the top of her game to win. As she sipped her coffee, her phone rang. It was her boss, Mr. Hayes, a seasoned attorney who had mentored her through law school. "Grace," he said, "I need you to take a look at this new case. It's high profile and could be your chance to shine." Grace's heart raced. "What's the case?" "It's a civil suit against a police officer for misconduct," he explained. "The officer's behavior during an arrest crossed the line, and the plaintiff wants justice. Think you're up for it?" Grace didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." Weeks later, Grace walked into the courtroom for the first hearing of the civil suit. She felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. The courtroom was packed with reporters eager to cover the trial of Officer Jason Miller. Jason entered the room exuding his usual confidence. He glanced at Grace but didn't recognize her. She kept her composure, though her pulse quickened. This was the man who had humiliated her, the man who had arrested her a year ago. She had spent countless nights replaying that moment in her mind, using it as fuel to keep going. Now she was face to face with him again, but this time the rules were reversed. Grace was no longer a powerless defendant. She was his opponent. As the proceedings began, Jason's smirk faded slightly. He hadn't expected the plaintiff's legal team to include someone as sharp and prepared as Grace. Her questions were precise, her arguments compelling. She challenged his every word, making him sweat under the intense scrutiny. But Jason didn't know who she really was yet. The first day of the trial ended, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters speculated about Grace's sudden rise in the legal world and her ability to hold her own against someone as experienced as Jason. But the real story was still hidden, waiting to be revealed. Grace returned to her office, her mind racing. She had kept her composure in court, but the emotions bubbling beneath the surface were hard to ignore. This was her chance to prove to herself and to Jason that she was no longer the woman he had mocked and arrested, and she wasn't going to waste it. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Officer Jason Miller as he stormed into the hallway, his face flushed with frustration. Reporters swarmed him, their cameras flashing as they hurled questions. "Officer Miller, how do you feel about today's proceedings? Do you believe the claims of misconduct are accurate?" Jason forced a tight smile. "No comment," he muttered before pushing through the crowd. He was seething. Who was this Grace Williams? And why did she seem so prepared to dismantle his every statement? He'd faced skilled lawyers before, but something about her unnerved him. Grace watched from the courtroom steps, her expression unreadable. She had expected him to be rattled, but seeing it in person gave her a strange sense of satisfaction. Still, she knew this was just the beginning. The trial would be a battle of endurance, and she couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. That evening, Grace sat at her desk replaying the events of the day in her mind. Her phone buzzed. It was Maya. "Hey, how'd it go?" her friend asked. "It was intense," Grace admitted. "I could see he wasn't expecting me to come at him so hard." Maya chuckled. "Serves him right. After what he did to you, he deserves to squirm." Grace's grip on the phone tightened. "It's not about revenge, Maya. It's about justice. He needs to understand that his actions have consequences." "Of course," Maya said, softening her tone. "But don't forget to take care of yourself. This can't be easy." "It's not," Grace admitted, "but I can handle it." She hung up and turned her attention back to her notes. The next day would be critical. She needed to establish a pattern of behavior, showing the court that Jason's misconduct wasn't an isolated incident. Across town, Jason sat at a bar with his colleague and longtime friend, Officer Mike Harris. "She's good," Jason admitted, downing his whiskey. "Too good. It's like she knows my every move before I make it." Mike shrugged. "She's just doing her job. Don't let her get in your head." Jason scoffed. "It's not that simple. There's something about her. Like I've seen her before." Mike frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Jason said, shaking his head. "It's probably nothing." But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Grace wasn't just another lawyer. There was a familiarity in her eyes, a quiet intensity that made him uneasy. The next morning, the trial resumed. Grace's first witness was a young man named David, who had filed a complaint against Jason a year earlier. David described a routine traffic stop that escalated when Jason accused him of hiding drugs. Despite finding nothing, Jason mocked and berated him in front of onlookers. Grace's questions were direct but empathetic. "David, how did Officer Miller's behavior affect you?" David hesitated, his voice trembling. "I was humiliated. I couldn't sleep for weeks, wondering what I did to deserve it." Jason's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the testimony to continue. Grace's strategy was working. She was painting a picture of a man who abused his authority, and the jury was paying attention. As the trial continued, The tension between Grace and Jason became impossible to ignore. The courtroom buzzed with speculation about Grace's past and her sudden rise to prominence. Jason's confidence began to waver as he pieced together the truth about who Grace really was. When he finally realized she was the woman he had arrested and mocked a year ago, the weight of his actions hit him like a punch to the gut. Grace, however, remained focused. This trial wasn't just about holding Jason accountable. It was about proving to herself that she had the strength to rise above her past. The trial reached its climax with Grace delivering a powerful closing argument. She wove together the testimonies and evidence into a narrative that was impossible to ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice unwavering, "this case is not just about one officer. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those entrusted with power do not abuse it. Officer Miller's actions have caused real harm to real people. Today, you have the chance to send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." The jury deliberated for hours before returning with a verdict. When they ruled in favor of the plaintiff, the courtroom erupted. Grace felt a wave of relief as her client hugged her, tears streaming down their face. Jason remained seated, his expression unreadable. As Grace packed her things to leave, he approached her, his hands in his pockets. "Grace," he said quietly, "thank you." She looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "For what?" "For holding me accountable," he said. "It's something I needed, even if I didn't realize it." Grace nodded. "I hope you mean that. Accountability isn't a one-time thing. It's a process." Jason watched her leave, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he felt the weight of what accountability truly meant. It wasn't just about facing the consequences. It was about choosing to do better every day moving forward.